Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Legal 500 and Diligent webinar, Sustainable Finance, What the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures Means for Business. My name is Joe Boswell. I am head of the Legal 500 GC Powerlist series, and I'll be introducing and hosting today's session. We're taking a deep dive into what you need to know about upcoming mandatory climate-related disclosures in the UK, and we're going to have a chat about the wider ESG scene in general. First of all, while I introduce the panelists, I've got a quick poll for you, which I'm going to put up on the screen now. Basically, we would like to know how much you in the audience know about what the TCFD requirements are. And then Adrian is going to tailor his presentation at the start based on what responses come back. So I'll introduce the panel quickly while we're waiting for the votes to come in for that. We have Natalie Solunke, who is Head of Legal at RVU, Adrian Fleming, Vice President for ESG and Sustainability at Diligent, and Anthony Kenny, Associate General Counsel at GSK, who you might have seen on one of our webinars before. Right, let's have a look at these. Yeah, so as we were expecting, the majority of the audience doesn't have the quite the understanding of TCFD that they would like. But you're in luck because we have an expert here who is going to share some of his expertise with you in the audience. So I'll end the poll there. As you can see, the most common answer is that people have little understanding of TCFD requirements. Cool. Oh, sorry, I forgot to share. Yeah, there you go. You can see the results there. Okay, so I'll throw over to Adrian now, who's going to give us an introduction to TCFD, and then we'll have our roundtable discussion after that. So thanks very much, Adrian. Please go ahead. You're on mute, Adrian.
Just couldn't get the mute button. Hi, everyone. And it took me a moment to find the correct presentation based on the poll responses there. I'll be able to kind of tailor this a little bit for everyone's benefit. There's no need to frantically take notes either. I'll be sharing these slides with the attendees afterwards, and they are full. Well, I wouldn't say full, but there are some good tips and tricks and some helpful resources in there as well that you might find useful over the next little while. I've entitled this presentation Demystifying the TCFD because I'm trying to be as practical as possible to kind of outline some of the misconceptions and to clarify some common misunderstandings or common misnomers. So if I get into this, there we go. So just to start, one of the most common misunderstandings I encounter is it's around terminology. So within this ESG space, you could say that there's, the veritable acronym SOUP. It's a phrase that has been around for about 10 years now, but it's never been as true as it is now. And what I've tried to do here is I've just tried to categorize some of the key acronyms that come up into groupings that kind of explain them. So, for example, under frameworks, which I've included TCFD, I also include GRI and the UN SDGs. And the way to think of frameworks is more like guidelines and recommendations as to how you should report. And I'll just kill the video because I'm conscious my connection is lagging a little. So on the framework side, so think of these more like guidelines and recommendations. On the standards side of things, you've got things like SASB, which is now rolling into the IASB, which is now part of the IRR, and you've also got the CDSB, which are now part of that, following a recent kind of merger. And that provides a much more prescriptive standard as to how and what you should report. And within SASB, it's actually done on a sector by sector basis, right down to individual sector categories as well. So if you are looking at the SASB piece, have a look at the SASB materiality matrix, and it will give you some good guidance as to what the minimum that you should be reporting would be. And of course, the greenhouse gas protocol, which has been around I'd say nearly 20 years at this stage, but definitely more than 15 years. And it provides a very solid grounding on how one would calculate a greenhouse gas emission for a large organization, or for any organization, and provides good guidance on that. Now, the other thing people often mix up with some of these acronyms are some of the reporting initiatives. So the reporting initiatives like the CDP, which is around the longest, and used to be known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, is effectively a questionnaire. It comes out once a year, and responding companies are asked a series of questions, both quantitative and qualitative, around their climate change. Now, obviously, within CDP, there's also climate change, forests and water, but overwhelmingly the most popular one is the climate one. DJSI, also known as RobecoSAM or S&P Global more recently, used to be known as the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, and it as well is a questionnaire that responding companies fill out and respond to, but it's slightly different to the CDP in that it's a bit broader than just climate change. It brings into play some other governance social elements as well. And then you've got other ones like GRES, which is a real estate focused one. And there's many, many others depending upon the sector that you operate in. So I'm going to just try and, I could go on all day about the various acronyms that are in this space, but in the context of today, the TCFD one, which is the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures, is perhaps the most relevant and the one that is most topical. But I think it's important to just understand where that sits in the overall context of the other framework standards and reporting initiatives that are being discussed at large as well. So to give you just a little bit of background, I'm not going to read through this in too much detail, just to say that in the overall kind of evolution of standards and frameworks over the past 10, 15 years, TCFD is a relatively recent one. It was really only established in 2015, and the first edition of the recommendations was really only published in 2017. So it really only became kind of active around that time. I will say that since 2017, terrific work has been done by the CDSB, headed up by Marty McBride, which is now part of the SASB, IASB, and IRR, which is another set of acronyms to do with integrated reporting. And they've been trying to align the TCFD with some of those other reporting initiatives and standards as well. So what you're encountering today is a lot easier to digest than it was in 2017. So no matter how overwhelming you might be feeling on some of this stuff, it's a lot simpler today than it was just 4 or 5 years ago. The most common question I'm being asked these days is around the SEC announcement. In short, the SEC, has passed a proposal to include climate disclosure requirements. This would be required as part of reports such as the 10K. What is going to be required to be reported is Scope 1, Scope 2, and some Scope 3. Now, there's going to be some debate over the next 60 days where there's a public comment period. So the clear definitions upon what would be included specifically around Scope 3, I think, would be clarified. And it may be that it may be rejected as well, and we'll cover that in a few moments' time as well. So how is TCFD different is another question that people often ask in terms of, the other frameworks. If a company is already using GRI in their annual sustainability report, do they need to abandon that and go to TCFD? Or, if they've been doing a CDP response, well then, should they start to focus on TCFD, SASB versus TCFD? All of these questions come up. And, TCFD isn't that much different than the others, only that it's very climate change focused. So you could consider TCFD to be like a subset of GRI, because GRI covers, all facets of ESG, and is very prescriptive in terms of how a company would disclose its performance and activities across a wide variety of topics, whereas TCFD tends to focus on climate change. There are 4 main core recommendations that it follows on. Some people call these pillars around governance, strategy, and risk. and how you address the governance strategy and risk, which may sound very lofty and very complicated, but the guidance is very concise. Actually, it's one of the more concise sets of guidance documentations that I have encountered. So I would encourage you to take the time to actually have a read through it. And I have the links to that as well at the back of this presentation for you later. And depending upon how you address the governance strategy and risk management areas, that will determine your targets and metrics. Now, often people start with targets and metrics, and then they work backwards, right? So I would suggest that having a read of the TCFD guidance document and just having a look at, how the company should address governance strategy and risk, and then tying that into targets and metrics is probably a better approach. And we'll cover that in a little bit more detail. A notable omission for today is I'm leaving out scenario analysis. And that's perhaps for another day's conversation. It's a little bit more complex and a little bit more involved, but effectively it just challenges the respondent to consider scenarios whereby climate change will impact materially the business, and to discuss those internally and to see how do those scenarios impact your governance strategy and risk as well. But I didn't want to go into that in too much detail because I'm conscious of today's attendee base. Another document which I would point you to as well when you're considering some of these reporting frameworks would be to have a look at the TCFD metrics and targets, a guidance document. And within that, there is a section C, which is climate related metrics. And this is where a lot of fear and a lot of concern from companies comes from. And it can be answered by just highlighting this one section here. And I'm not going to read it out, only to say that, it points to the greenhouse gas protocol as a foundation for you to use, in terms of how, the how you calculate, the how you measure and report. Excuse me. But you'll see in several places across these documents, you'll see, mention of assumptions, limitations, and things like that. And the main thing is to be transparent. Everyone understands that it's very difficult to get this kind of information out there into the ether within a short period of time. So where there is any uncertainty around the data that you're disclosing, be clear on what those uncertainties are. Be transparent. And if you are making assumptions, clarify what those are and make them public. And so therefore you shouldn't have any nasty surprises at the end. And I think that's perhaps the single golden rule that I would encourage people to take away from today. So who is impacted by this SEC announcement? It's public companies in the US, which also impacts accounting and investment firms. And that latter phrase has yet to be clarified. But it's public companies in the US is the main one. When does this SEC announcement impact these companies? Well, this table here gives you a clearer view on the timelines and what exactly is required as well. And this is the current proposal. And, again, another question I am often asked around the limited assurance versus reasonable assurance. And while I wouldn't claim to be an expert on those specific nuances, suffice to say that, if you're reporting your data and you have a third party verifying that information, a reasonable assurance goes into far more depth than a limited assurance. And that's as simple as I could make it for today's audience. It's important to note as well that this stuff is on a 60-day kind of challenge period. So I think during this 60-day period, there's two things to consider. If it's passed, the public companies will be required to disclose scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions based on the metrics in the TCFD framework. That's a given. If it's rejected, this is where I would say is an actual opportunity for people to kind of buy some time and use it for prep work. Day in, day out, I'm surprised to find companies that are looking at this for the very first time, and they are shocked at how inaccessible the nature of their underlying GHG data is. They find it really difficult to get their head around that. And time again, we encounter companies that say, okay, we want to report our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions entirely within the next 9 months, only to discover when they start looking for the data that they need, that actually it's inaccessible, or it doesn't exist, or it hasn't been captured in their ERP system. For most companies, it's a journey. It doesn't happen in a single year. It can take multiple years for you to get the underlying data in line for you to actually put together these reports. So if it is rejected, I would say that that's a blessing in disguise for many people to use it as prep time, get your house in order. And the other thing I would say as well is, some of the dialogue that I'm hearing from institutional investors over the past week or two in particular, but it has been, for the past couple of years, but over the last week or two, they're starting to have a heightened, risk recognition of non-disclosed GHG data ahead of this. So even if it is rejected, it is something that the institutional investors are going to be looking at anyway, and they're going to be treating it on the basis of, well, if company A actually is already disclosing this information voluntarily, then they're in pretty good shape ahead of any type of reporting legislation that comes at them in the next few years. So again, I'm going to finish with the last 2 slides here, only that people keep asking me about this. So, it would be remiss of me to say so. Diligent ESG, which was formerly Acuvio, which was the deep climate solution that Diligent acquired last year. This is a purpose-built solution that is available off the shelf today that deals with CDP and TCFD, among all of the other acronyms. But interestingly as well, a subset of this Acuvio product has been released under what's called ESG Lite, which makes it exceptionally easy for organizations to get going and aids that data discovery piece that I mentioned earlier on. So there are solutions out there that are ready to go. So it's not like in many other in many other years down through the years, like for those of you in the UK who remember the CRC. When that was announced, we were all waiting for products and solutions to be developed, to be brought to market, to address that. But in this case, there are existing solutions out there, and Diligent ESG, formerly Acuvio, is ready and willing. I'm going to leave you with some of these helpful resources. If you're after today's webinar, there is an additional webinar being run by the Diligent Institute on Friday. It's Friday evening GMT time, but I won't be able to attend myself, but it's being headed up by Dottie, who is the head of the Diligent Institute. So it's going to be a very interesting session, some good speakers on that. And there's also a Diligent Climate Leadership, so you can actually get certified in ESG for any of you who are looking to upskill on some of this topical information. And the last 2 links here, I would recommend that you have a look at. They're basically after wading through all the information that's on the TCFD website, these 2 links provide both the recommendations and the guidance on metrics. So they would be your 2 key reads. So I'll leave it at that for today, and happy to take any questions later on. Back to you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Hopefully everyone's a little bit more up to speed with some of the requirements that they might have to deal with over the next coming months after that. Really interesting. So now we're going to move on to our roundtable discussion. And the first person I want to speak to was Anthony. So I'm going to keep this reasonably broad. We're going to move on to more of the wider ESG agenda now. So Anthony, I wanted to ask you, I think were either at or were certainly interested in the COP26 summit. What do you think businesses need to consider in a post COP26 world? Has it changed the calculus at all?
Yeah, I think it has. Hopefully you can hear me okay, and apologies.
Yeah,
I'm
coming through
in my
loud and
car
clear
because of, I guess, this kind of hybrid working, called into the office urgently and not quite making it in time. So, but the show must go on, right, Joe? So we
Yeah.
make
Nice. Thanks very
exactly.
much.
So
Very diligent.
apologies. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think let's keep it broad, ESG, and then let's zoom in on climate and COP26. I mean, ESG is the topic of the moment. I think it's top of every board's agenda. It's it's if not an enterprise risk, it's certainly a high level risk that boards are considering for a whole bunch of reasons. Multiple stakeholders interested. Yeah, GSK was a sponsor of COP26, so I wasn't there personally. I didn't get to go, but Emma Walmsley was very active participant, and we approached this very much from a two lenses. One, net zero. How are we going to strive for net zero, and then also how are we going to move towards what we call nature positive. So which I like, because it's focus on net zero is good. Focus on how we're going to deal with climate change is good through the lens of net zero. But I think it's also important to think of nature positive, which I think is a broader concept around how we're treating the environment. How does our interactions with the products we develop, how we run our factories in terms of water management, in terms of the use of plastic. It's a broader topic, and I think I like that. And yeah, I mean, my take on COP26 was that it made progress. It certainly moved the dial a bit in terms of coal and other big issues. I think time will tell as to how much of that's going to be carried forward with real energy. I think clearly, without getting too political, what's happening in the Ukraine now is obviously impacting that, because that rightly has the focus of everyone's attention from a business and from a sanctions. Is a very complicated situation, but also the impact on energy usage and how that's going to impact some of the commitments around COP26 is, I think, already starting to bite, and we'll have to monitor that. So I think it's going to be, I guess at some point, hopefully if Ukraine gets resolved, even if it doesn't, there's going to have to be a recalibration of what people maybe promised during COP26 towards the end of this year, I assume. But yeah, I felt that what came out of that was within our company, but also just generally within the business community, actually leading up to COP26, a lot of energy, which I think carried through COP26 and then carried on quite a while afterwards. I think it's still there, but as I think has been slightly diminished by what's happening in the kind of broader geopolitical environment at the moment. So I don't know if that's broad enough for you, Joe. I'm happy to kind of.
Well, I thought your point about the Ukraine there is interesting, because we had a question from someone in the audience about that as well. So as it's come up, I thought we might as well. Yeah, I mean, the question is, does the Ukraine crisis and the corresponding reminder of the importance of oil to the global economy present an unassailable challenge to net zero goals?
I'm not sure I wouldn't go as far as to say it's unassailable, but I think the energy and the promises made last October and November will have to be adjusted, and I think UK government's going along that path. I mean, inevitably the access to oil and gas will, and the economic hike in prices, just accessing it will I think create challenges for governments in the West. So we'll have to wait and see how that happens. But hopefully it will be a temporary blip until there's a broader economic issue there as well, in terms of when you start imposing sanctions, can they come back through in terms of banking system impacts and collapses, and so there's this whole macroeconomic environment needs to settle down. We need to understand where it's going and how it settles down and what impact that will have, because that will, I think, drive and impact policies around what people have committed to around COP26. And I say my take on it is, sadly, it will have a negative impact, I think, at least in the short term. And as we know, that's a danger, because already the disappointing aspect of COP26 is that it didn't go far enough, wasn't aggressive enough in the context of the bigger issue around the environment. And so, yeah, it's worrying to think that the commitments, which were probably just about okay, are being watered down and diluted. So, yeah, I guess watch the space.
Well, hopefully that'll get sorted soon, and then we can maybe move back onto it. don't know. That's not really the subject of this webinar. Anyway, Natalie, I wanted to ask you a similar question, but obviously you're based in a very different sector to Anthony. So I just wanted to, basically ask you the same thing or similar thing. What have you seen over the past year or so in the way that your company's changed the way it deals with ESG matters, or maybe not, your company necessarily, but just the industry as a whole? How have you seen the ESG response change?
Sure. So I think just to make it clear that RVU, you probably don't know as a brand, but you've probably heard of component brands. So we're kind of in this sort of technology space. I think ultimately, a lot of companies are just taking it more seriously. I think if we look at the pandemic, and I hate going, oh, let's look at the COVID pandemic, but it has definitely had an impact on companies and just the way that they interact with people, and also the wider kind of world and ecosystem in which we're kind of living in. So if we think about it, things like sort of flexible working, seeing people in their home environment, recognizing that people are humans, thinking actually about something on a grand scale that can really affect the globe and the global economy, just means that a lot of these things are more at the forefront of, I guess, naturally kind of progressive companies, and those that aren't, are going to be dragged along by their employees anyway. So I think what we're seeing is a recognition as well that people, and that's employees, that might be pushing up within their organizations, actually care about being part of a good company. And it's not just about making money, although, we can recognize that actually there are statistics to say that, good companies that have got a decent ESG agenda are better performing investment assets. So we've already got that out there. So we recognize that, but we recognize that there's a strong desire to try and do the right thing. Then, that's kind of the journey that we're on from a more kind of heart's perspective. I guess from a mind's perspective, mandatory reporting effectively is forcing organizations to actually take a look at what they think they are in terms of how they're performing and how good they are. So if we look at it in terms of, the green piece, then, this is actually making sure that, normally what gets measured does get improved. Whereas if you're not measuring it in the first place, how are you really likely to actually create that sort of baseline to know that you want to progress and move into something? So, I think that's like, that's like super, super positive. In terms of what we've been doing as an organization, we are a private equity backed, company. Silver Lake are our investors. So, it's definitely been something that I think, cleanly for the past year or so, and ignore my dog, he's got a view on mandatory. They did actually hire a head of ESG, which I think shows their commitment to go, right, well, across their portfolio, they recognise that this is an important, dimension of how they need to think about the investments in their assets, but also if they're going to sort of flip their assets later on, this is something that's going to have a price tag attached to it. And as I said before, there's definitely recognition in the investment space of that. So, an ESG head has been appointed. I think there's an analyst as well that we can leverage. Equally, my sister company is Zoopla. So we're part of the ZPG group. That's the investment that the PE fund has, in us. And they've actually appointed a head of ESG as well. And I think it's interesting, there was a question here I thought was quite good to talk about, which was, is it helpful to have ESG under one banner, or all these issues that need to be tackled separately with different approaches? And I think I'll touch upon that. We've got some other questions that are going to talk about this more in terms of my organisation's approach. But you kind of want to approach it from the top, because you want to make sure that you've got somebody with the right kind of gravitas within your organisation to make sure it's clearly on the agenda. But equally, you need people within the organisation who are actually passionate about this stuff, or are mandated or enabled to actually look into this stuff to bring it all together. Because ultimately, reporting is, a way of getting metrics, but the underlying sort of substance is down to culture. It's down to how people behave, and it's down to the individuals within the organisation, the different things they're doing. Because actually, what you do in green doesn't necessarily have any bearing on, what your social agenda is and how you treat your employees. Equally, governance isn't always led by these things. It's quite a separate thing. So I think you will have different subject matter experts across your organisation that are going to have that depth of knowledge, but it helps to have somebody, coordinating that information, as we've talked, as Adrian and both Anthony said, it is a big data exercise. I think a lot of people kind of get a bit rabbit in headlights about it, but ultimately it's something that you're going to have to do as you're progressing in terms of growing as a company, or if you're going to be a listed organisation in due course, you know where you need to get to. So why not start to set those foundations sort of sooner rather than later, and get the right resourcing so that you've already got somebody knowing where the pain points are. But I'll touch upon that a little bit later on.
Cool. Before we move on to our next topic, I thought we could do another poll. So have a look at this. The question is, in your opinion, what is the main internal ESG challenge facing your company? And you've got 4 options to choose from there. Obviously, there are more challenges than this as well, but this is just, we wanted to use this to sort of start a conversation. Just leave this up for a minute or so. Yeah, while we're waiting for that, I wondered if either Adrian or Natalie had any thoughts on the question that came in before about the Ukraine, and whether it will sort of change the way climate reporting is done in the future. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, whatever about climate, I have noticed that there's some interesting conversations going on under the ESG banner, and this might relate to another question that came in, but it was kind of a little bit more vague around, the banner of ESG. With the sanctions being imposed upon oligarchs and so on and so forth, and there was a recent, I think it was November, there was a new EU regulation brought in. Forgive me, I can't remember the exact name of it, but it was around giving better visibility to the shareholders in particular companies, particularly in a chain of ownership. And this is, coming up again and again at a senior executive level within organizations under the ESG banner in terms of, supply chains and, responsible shareholders and things like that. And I'm fascinated by how that has happened and how the Ukraine crisis has spurned this conversation out of relatively nowhere. And I'm intrigued by the timing of that EU piece of regulation that actually, facilitates this kind of deeper investigation as well to shareholders. I am not the qualified person to comment on the detail of the legal side of that, but I just find it fascinating from an ESG perspective that it's coming up in ESG conversations. Yeah, that's all I would say there. I think I think Anthony kind of already covered the impact of the Ukraine on oil and whether or not that's unassailable or not.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It went from sort of 0 to 100 in terms of investigating anyone with Russian links to any business, whatever. Anyway, but right, okay. So we've had the poll questions come in. Interestingly, the most common answer in terms of the main internal ESG challenge facing a company is to do with monitoring and reporting on ESG data. And tied for second place is consolidating environmental and social data. So yeah, similar really. I suppose from this we can sort of get that people are finding it difficult to quantify, I suppose.
Well, what I would read from this, Joe, is lining it up with the earlier poll where overwhelmingly the audience are kind of in the earlier stage of understanding this area, that there is probably in the journey stage there's probably a bit of figuring out being done at the moment, which is aligned to the first point here, building the foundations of an ESG program. Similarly, these are all very equally shared, to be fair. And then, even the consolidating environmental and social data. Monitoring and reporting on ESG data always comes up as number one on these kinds of things because it's just so challenging and so broad. It's interesting to look at the other 3, how close they are to it, because normally monitoring and reporting on ESG data is way out in front. But in this instance, I think because of the journey stage of many of today's attendees, I think they're, perhaps if I could infer, they're they're perhaps at the stage where they're figuring stuff out, as opposed to actually they're not quite there yet with monitoring and reporting the data just yet. That would be my read of it.
And just to dive in, Joe, if I may quickly, I mean, I think the challenge we have in the current situation, I think will exist for a while, is you've got potentially multiple organizations asking for data, looking at it through different lenses, and as a global organization, particularly, you're reporting in different ways and across human rights, across climate, and it's a lot of I mean, just looking. I mean, we've just published our ESG report, which is available on our via websites. It goes to about 30 or 40 pages. A heck of a lot of effort goes into that, and as you can imagine, as for an organization of GSK size, if it's challenging for us to do it, how difficult must it be for organizations who are smaller, who've got business as usual activity to do as well, all in an environment where it's still new, you're not clear about what's being asked of you, and as I say, some multiple stakeholders asking for different forms of information. I think it's going to take a while for it to settle down into an easy way to get people feeling confident that they're on top of it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, I think it's time to move on to our second topic, which is how companies can ensure compliance, basically from the top to bottom of their organizations. So yeah, I'll start with you, Natalie. How have you I know you mentioned earlier that employees are generally quite happy to be part of an organization which they like and they think has good values. But having said that, yeah, how have you sort of driven home the importance of ESG compliance to employees at RVU?
Sure. So I think it's kind of going back to that cultural point I mentioned before. So, RVU as a business, we want to be a great place to work. And, one of our values, or it is one of our values, is how we can leave the wood pile higher than we found it. So we're very much kind of motivated and tend to employ people who have that kind of mantra in mind. So I think we're already fortunate enough that I think there's a lot of people in our organisation that definitely want to contribute to something bigger than just the bottom line, which I think helps. So I think, just doing the kind of more housekeeping stuff in relation to the mandatory reporting that we talked about before, and just kind of, I think sometimes when you're in a legal and compliance function, that's a good way of interacting with other employees in the business because they see it as more as an official work thing. So in my capacity as our general counsel, I can go around to the business and go, it's really important that we are looking at this sort of data. How are we going to come up with how we get that? Do we need to actually get more resource? The sort of things that I mentioned, earlier. So as I mentioned to you before, I think that proactivity in relation to just data capture, we've already seen the kind of data and monitoring anxiety that's out there, which is effectively how are we going to get this stuff? I think you do really need to treat it like probably any change project. And I think if you kind of tackle it in that kind of more structured way, I think it's easier to then get the sort of requisite sort of buy-in because, as was alluded to before, it's not just one person's problem, it's a joint responsibility across the organisation. So yes, there will be certain sort of areas that will have more of a focus on, GHG, etc. But, on the governance side and other things, you're going to have, different stakeholders. So I think, for us, it's, as I said before, it's not just about that kind of box ticking, it's about the substance as well. So I think, one of the things that I did, which I thought was a really an interesting way of tackling this kind of, how do you know how good you are, or how do you know how ready you are, and what are the sort of questions that are going to be on the agenda in relation to ESG? I think the B Corp is a really interesting organisation to consider. So they've got a lot of information on their website. Effectively, for people that don't know what B Corp is, it stands for Better Corporation. And effectively, it's a framework that exists, that's been put together, a globally recognised framework that companies effectively assess themselves against certain criteria in the ES and the G to see how good they are. And effectively, they get a score. An entry into the kind of B Corp club, I think, is 80 out of, I think, a maximum of 200 points. If you get that 80, it means essentially you're considered good. Now, I use that framework as a way to start thinking about, test running. How easy is it to get some of this data? So we talked about the GHG data. We talked about energy companies. That's when we realised, oh my God, it's going to be pretty difficult to get this data. It could take, lead time of up to 6 months. That's not good. so actually doing this dry run for our brands, and it was across Uswitch and Money, which is a different brand we own, we were able to kind of, get a good picture for that. And what I did is I shared the learnings with our senior leadership. I shared the kind of different things across different divisions. So, if we had the sort of green sort of piece of it, we kind of spoke to certain people. We looked at the employee side of things. We spoke to HR. Looked at this kind of, the charitable kind of initiatives as well. So that's something that's also considered, how much you're actually giving back to the community. And we have a pay it forward team, which is a charitable kind of arm, was really able to kind of take a lot of that and just more holistically think about, our performance. So that was something I got a lot of visibility across the business through our kind of business reviews that we do quarterly. It's a question I put to the organisation, which is, do you think it's worth us doing this dry run? The people bought into it, and so that's what we did. And people want to be part of a journey, as I said before, which is feeling like it's contributing to something bigger. So I think really kind of looking at it in that way and looking at how you harness people's natural passions. People are going to do their day job, they're going to give whatever they need to do their job. How do you actually get people who are passionate about this sort of thing, and a lot of people are, to actually then add more value to your organisation? So yeah, that was our approach anyway.
Like taking a positive approach to.
I might just add to that,
Yeah, go ahead.
Joe, that I agree with everything Natalie has said there, and that's very, that's an excellent representation of it. I would only add that, sometimes I encounter companies that when they start looking at, gathering data and compliance with various things like that, they sometimes end up spinning their wheels on hard to reach data. And when you ask the question, is it material? There's kind of a blank expression, or perhaps they look at each other. It's perhaps something that's often overlooked is a materiality assessment, even if it's just a desktop exercise. Just challenging an organization's assumptions on what data should they be reporting on and looking for, and prioritizing it. And then, there might be two tracks. You could have one track which is reporting the data that you do have, and a separate track which is working on getting the data for perhaps year two, and improving the systems for year two. And I think, various stakeholders, including institutional investors, are acutely aware that you can't get all of the data in year one, but it's about having a plan to get year two, year three in order as well. It's important. So that's the only thing I would add to what Natalie has said there.
Well said. Anthony, I know this is something we've spoken about before, but why is it that you think that in-house lawyers are among the best people in an organisation to build a sort of positive, progressive culture in a business?
So before I start, anything I say in terms of general comments is not meant to be offensive to any private practice lawyers on the line. I know there are some. I say some of the things I say will apply to private practice lawyers as well, but so I'm going to be generalizing a little bit. So yeah, I think as an overall comment, I think most in-house counsel, particularly those people like myself and Natalie, are very, very fortunate to have a business-wide view of what's going on, across the whole business. We see, from supply chain through to, what's going on in the corporate center. So that gives in-house lawyers, the in-house team, an amazing, I think probably quite unique view in any business of the whole business, and therefore can see when something like this comes along. And then there are other things like data privacy. There's always the regulations which can have an impact on the business. We have the ability to see and that translate that into business impact. I think another reason why we have, so we have a seat at the table, if you want to call it that, which gives us a very broad inside knowledge. I think also we're fortunate again to have through our private practice colleagues, but also through some of the organizations we might work with, like the Big Four or the consultancy firms, or Diligent. Let's call it Diligent out. There are a lot of organizations we work with which are producing some really great thoughtware and content around these issues, which we can assimilate and bring to our businesses. And I think it would be also wrong for me not to call out an organization called Lawyers for Net Zero, which I've been a part of, which is especially focused on in-house counsel, which is because of that, all the things I've just said, it's an organization which is pulling together, I think it's up to about 60 in-house counsel GCs, where we're actually sharing ideas about how we're approaching sustainability and climate change, which I think is good as well. And I think, again, but this is where my kind of introductory comment was coming in. I think mostly, not all, but most in-house counsel have developed this kind of risk radar, ability to approach problems through a risk management lens, which I think is helpful for an environment like this, to look at an issue, to look at a regulation and say, do like a risk analysis and apply that risk analysis to the business in a pragmatic and practical and commercial way. So it's not just, these are the regulations, this is the law. What does this mean for us as a business? What processes do we need to change? What data do we need to gather? What are the things we need to think about? So I think there's that much more, pragmatic, direct conversation that we would have with the board versus maybe sometimes our external colleagues. But yeah, I think for all those reasons, I believe strongly that in-house counsel have, on all risks, but I think this one in particular have got a real role to play here. And I think we and I have to say, I'm also pleased from what I've seen so far in the past 2 or 3 years, how in-house counsel are stepping up. They are joining organisations like and I won't just call that out, the ACC, the Association of Corporate Counsel. They've just created a working group which I've signed up to, led by Mark Morris-Jones, who people may know as well. So there's a real energy now, I think, in the in-house community, which I think we've just got to keep building on.
Yeah, well said. Thank you very much, Anthony. Right, so we'll move on to our final topic, prepared topic anyway, which is the future. Obviously, we've touched on this a little bit. I'll start with you, Natalie. We've seen that obviously climate has been perhaps at the forefront of the ESG change agenda. Do you have any thoughts or predictions on what might be the next sort of arm of ESG, which might see a bit of attention going forward?
I think it touches upon probably the key theme of everything I've been saying, which is about people. And the reason I'm sort of saying that is that we're tackling the planet, and that's fine. But actually, we also need to think about the people in it and getting them in a good place so that they're happy to take on the planet and protecting it, right? So I do think that, and touching upon what you were saying earlier about the Ukraine and what's happening there, doing business with ethical businesses or countries or companies is really important. So like knowing your client, we talked about those checks, we talked about sanctions. I think people and businesses are going to be much more mindful, as I think was touched upon earlier, about their supply chains, who they interact with, their reputation, and about sort of doing the right thing. So I think that'll touch upon that kind of ethical side of who you should be interacting with. I think just the other point on the energy piece as well. I think we're already seeing it, and I think good old Boris sort of said that, well, if we're not going to be leveraging energy from Russia, we need to accelerate our own sort of sustainable energy agenda, right? So I think it's like we look at the pandemic, nobody's working from home, and now everybody's working hybrid pretty much. With that energy piece, finally maybe we're going to look at actually a decent strategy to become energy sustainable as a nation, which considering we're an island, we've got all this sea, we've got wind, we've got all these things, we haven't really been leveraging that particularly well. So I think maybe there will be this difficulty of some of the reporting and getting to those standards, but actually if it's going to in the long term accelerate a much kind of greener economy and sustainable energy for the country, I think that's going to be really, really interesting. But just going back to the point of what's sort of next for the ESG agenda, going back to the people side, then what are we really doing to tackle D&I, right? So we've got the planet sorted, we've got a roadmap anyway, we can be cynical about it, but at least we know what we're kind of doing there. What are we really doing on gender pay? What are we doing on ethnicity pay reporting? What are we doing on getting more women on boards? All that sort of thing. So I think, in order to kind of empower people to bring their best versions of themselves to work and to do the right things and go over and above for their organisations, the organisations have to give something, back a little bit more to kind of make sure that we are moving that dial in the right direction. We're not just box ticking, it's not just kind of lip service. It's actually that substance of people feeling like they can give their whole selves and they can give more. So that's what I think where we'll be going. But, I guess watch this space, right?
definitely. Adrian, we've seen moves already to climate-related non-financial disclosures, mandatory non-financial disclosures to companies. What could you see where the next non-financial disclosure area of non-financial mandatory disclosures might be going forward? What might be on government's radar going forward?
Yeah, I find the whole area fascinating. I suppose I've been in the sector since 2008, roughly speaking, and over that period of time, I've seen many different things, trends. I've seen how public discourse has influenced the arrival of new mandatory reporting and changes to standards and protocols and guidance, quite quickly. I mean, it was great to see, when there was revelations around BBC gender pay equality or inequality, that there was rapid change to getting new legislation in place that kind of aligned to the non-financial reporting directive, which was, I think, done in 35 days, which is phenomenal. So long may that continue. I think there's a couple of trends that jump out to me at the moment. The first is, there's a lot of discourse out there around the Great Resignation. And increasingly, there's a lot of conversation around how the millennials are using sustainability and ESG website or web pages of a company to kind of get a glimpse as to the type of culture at a particular company. They want to be part of the solution going forward, and I think that's fascinating. But what that has raised is, I think it's gone beyond the millennials, and it has gone broader still into the ESG website or the sustainability pages of a website. They seem to be giving an insight into companies' culture, but also authenticity. And I think authenticity is a phrase that's going to be big over the next few years, because there's a lot of companies talking about ESG without any substance in the background. And I think that authenticity thing is going to resonate quite a bit. The other thing, and Natalie kind of touched upon it, is the KYC, know your customer. I would bring that one step further, and I see that, there has been a lot of activity in the last couple of years around know your supplier. And that goes beyond just GHG and greenhouse gas emissions and stuff like that. It is venturing more into, the S and the G side of things. But one area that I think we're going to see big change in the future is the validation of that. Because if you think for a second, or if you pause for a moment and you think, we're basing our assumptions of a supplier or a supply chain performance on the basis of a supplier's response to a questionnaire. And we are trusting that the supplier is responding to this genuinely and truthfully, and is not applying a certain amount of salesmanship or marketing to it. And perhaps the truth is not as clear as it perhaps should be. So I think that there is an inevitable arrival in the coming years of a need for a validation or verification of those responses to by a third party. And I think that will be interesting. And I think that we're already seeing some technology providers out there looking at, how can they build in smarter tools and tricks and tips into these questionnaire response tools to figure out, is a respondent just playing around to get the optimal response in the questionnaire, or is it a truthful response? And so there's a few things there in there that I'm particularly interested in keeping an eye on, that I think have a lot of potential.
Definitely. So final prepared question for Anthony, and then we can move on to maybe one from the audience. But yeah, what is the next? Are there any methods you can see on the horizon from government or regulators that might be used to sort of compel companies towards more climate-friendly action? Anthony, do you think, or
yeah, no, and just as intrigued by what Adrian said, because I think I just build off that in many ways. Because I mean, when I think what's going to happen next, I think there's going to be more. I mean, you're already seeing this. I mean, again, for ESG generally, we've got a lot on climate change already. more coming. But also the human rights that in each, Norway, Switzerland, there's more countries coming online in terms of Modern Slavery Act type reporting. And you've got a directive in the pipeline as well, talking about those issues for the European level. I think coming probably next year, realistically. So there's still a number of pieces of legislation in the pipeline to come and land, and with processes and systems. And some of that will be still more kind of voluntary, but I think that my guess would be that the real shift will be most of that will become increasingly mandatory. I think that need to report, knowing that NGOs and a whole range of stakeholders are looking at that information, and then, as we've seen with Shell, litigating on it is going to be I think the governments probably don't need to do more than that. They set up the framework, they set up the structure, they set up the ask, and then they're going to almost leave it to the investor community, the shareholder activists, the litigation bar, quite frankly. Because I mean, I think there's some of the litigation at the moment is genuinely with a real purpose and cause behind it. But sure, as night follows day, the litigation bar, when they see there's some money to be made here, will maybe with more questionable motives, will pursue the big corporates on that basis. And I think, as Natalie said a few times, I think as well, governments know that people within businesses, people in terms of customers, patients, whatever sector you're in, are going to be demanding more. And the court of public opinion, as we've seen on many, many occasions in recent times, will be a judge and jury. And businesses know that. And there's so much now information, and you see it day in, day out, how much of a company's market cap is linked to its reputation. I think that's going to, all of these things come together to really compel businesses to take this really seriously. And so I don't think governments need to do too much more, other than maybe what I'd like them to do would be to kind of consolidate at a global level. I'd like it for us as a community to move more towards science-based measures, because I think another of Adrian's points, what's going to be critical here is to kind of sort the fluff, the greenwashing from the real. We're doing this, and it's actually here's demonstrably we're doing this, and here's the evidence to prove it.
Yeah, definitely. Right. We're almost at the midday mark, which is when we were planning on ending. So I think maybe we'll just have one audience question and then we'll end it there. But while we're doing that, there's another quick poll, which hopefully you can answer if you've got a minute. Right. So let me pick one of these. All right. So got a question from the audience. Is an investment fund or something similar going to be obliged to make sure every company under them is doing all their reporting to regulation standards? Does anyone know?
I mean, I think the short answer is probably yes, because if you think of like scope 3 emissions and kind of going down through your supply chain, I think you've got to really, if you're taking it seriously, you've got to think, and each supply chain will be different, right? So I guess as a fund, your supply chain is all the different companies that you're investing in, and arguably there. So that's where it starts to get complicated, because then how far down do you go? But I think it's not going to be acceptable to not really, if you're an asset manager, you've got to really understand what your portfolio is doing and how they're reporting and what their position is.
Perhaps if I could direct that person to the SFDR regulation as well, which impacts asset managers in particular, I think you'll find that very, very relevant to that question.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right. Well, I think we were planning to end at midday, so we're right on schedule. I suppose all there is to say is thank you very much to our panelists for turning up. That was a really, really interesting talk, and hopefully our audience has come away a lot more informed than they were at the start. And just to remind everyone, this was a Legal 500 and Diligent webinar, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot for turning up, and have a great rest of the day. Thanks a lot, guys.